Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we are going to take up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 3rd of September 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let's now begin the discussion.
Here is an important announcement. In our weekly series of mains question assignment from DNS, the question for today's assignment is: in spite of government's initiatives, the adoption of electric mobility in India is saddled with multifaceted challenges. Elaborate. The question is of 10 marks and needs to be answered in around 150 words. This question has been created from the DNS discussion of 9th of August 2020. From the discussion which was titled as Electric Vehicles Policy, Need, Initiatives and Challenges. You may watch the discussion before writing your answer. However, there are few important things that you must follow. You can type the answer in the comment box, or you can click the image or the JPG file and send your answers to us. All those who will send the answers by Saturday will get the evaluation and the feedback from Rouse IAS teachers. Post your answers in the portrait mode only, and also you should not post your answers in someone else's answers. Use the comment or post your answer at the bottom of the thread to submit your answer to the main thread, and it should not appear as commenting on someone else's answers. Also, you should try to keep a tab on time taken. Mention the time you take to write your answer on the top. You can also mention the city and state where you are posting your answers from. This is important because it will help us in knowing that DNS is reaching every nook and corner of our country. In the description of the video, there is a link for the question assignment where you can participate in the discussion on Rouse IAS eLearn platform. This particular article, A Missed Opportunity, appears on page number 7 as an article. And it talks about the Gopalakrishna Committee, which has published its draft report as to how the data governance should be set up in our country. And it lays out few of the important aspects which have been left out by this committee. It basically expresses the disappointment with respect to the draft report which has been recently open for public consultation. So in this regard, we'll start by first understanding data as a resource and how important it has become in the current economic context, and then how the current structure of the data sharing, its economic uses, and how to earn profit is governed currently. Then we will look into the matters of current rights of the users and how they are bypassed. And in this regard, we will deal with the positive consequences. And the negative consequences are the ones which have been laid out by the authors of this article in today's newspaper. So if you have to establish the importance of data in today's commercial world, you can just use these 3 important indicators. So 7 out of the top 10 companies across the world, as far as the market capitalization are concerned, the 7 out of top 10 companies across the world are based on data. So they are data-centric companies. So just like in earlier times, companies across the world were dominated by oil and automobile, in 2020 they are dominated by the companies which are based on data. Around the world currently, around 97% of all businesses use data. So only 3% of the businesses across the world are the ones which are not using any kind of internet data in their overall scheme or strategy. And if you dig further, you will see that around 76% of the all businesses make data as an integral part of their strategy. So for example, it could deal with an advertising on Facebook or on YouTube, or it could be about utilizing the Google search optimization to increase their market share. So this is the importance of data in present context. So what is data? We know that we are provided by a lot of services, both by our internet service provider and also by a lot of applications, for example, Instagram and YouTube. And before installing them or before you can use them, you must have read the approval which is needed to use their services. They ask for the permission to look into your cookies, browsing history, locations, and they also want to look into your contact list as well because they want to map your contacts or your friends and families. So these are the commonly available customer information which are much sought after. Utilizing these, companies decide their strategies. A simple example would be an advertisement of a restaurant once you walk into its locality. So currently, the advertisements can be geotagged and you can pay Google Maps to display the information or advertisement of your restaurant once a customer walks into this shaded region, as this area can be easily accessible by your restaurant services. So this is one of the examples. You must also have coincidentally stuck upon an advertisement related to an object which you were discussing with your friends that you have made up your mind to buy it. And once you open your Instagram, you see the advertisement of the same product over there. So this has been enabled because of the access these companies have to our personal lives, and they are mining on that to increase their profits and increase their visibility. And hence now data has been universally recognized as most valuable economic resource. So if it is a resource, just like a natural resource, for example, coal or any other mineral, the question arises as to the rights of the utilization of these resources. Who has the economic rights to various kinds of data? And once the ownership has been established, next question is how these rights can be exercised. And if we talk about the present structure, it is totally ungoverned. There is no clear-cut understanding across the globe as to who has the economic rights to various kinds of data. Of course, currently, the company which collects the data owns the data and reaps the benefits. So for example, if you are using Google search, it will collect the data on your search options and it will have the ownership rights, and then it will sell your search queries to other private companies and earn profits on that. And this current unorganized structure also suits the most powerful actors that dominate globally, which are Alphabet Inc., which is the parent company of Google, and also Facebook. Now it is obviously understood that some rights do exist, right? And they mainly deal with protection from harm. For example, it is mandatory for all the apps to obtain consent before they take your data. And of course, if you don't agree to their terms and conditions of using your media or the gallery or your location, of course, if you don't agree to their conditions of using these resources, you will not be allowed access, but nonetheless, consent is required. And the second is, of course, they tell you that before selling your data, they anonymize your personal data. Now, what does this anonymization means? Now, data anonymization is basically a process by which a personal data is altered in such a way that a data subject can no longer be identified directly or indirectly either by the data controller or any third party. So for example, let's say Google has collected your location data and it has found out the places you have visited in last month. And it has also identified the shopping malls in which you frequently visit. Now, of course, you would never want Google to reveal this pattern of shopping to the third parties. Now, what Google has done is that it has removed your name, your address, and everything which can be used to identify the person. And then it sells the data. So if this data is sold to a third party, they cannot utilize the pattern of your locations in order to find out who the person is. So these two, obtaining consent and anonymizing the personal data, are the ways in which the rights of a person are bypassed. So when we claim that they are using our data, the Google will immediately say that of course we have obtained consent from you. And then they say that not only we have obtained consent from you, but we have already anonymized your data and hence there is no threat to privacy. If you claim that my privacy is being violated, just look at the data I have given to the third party. Third party will not be able to recognize this person using on the data I have provided to them. So this is a peculiar case currently, and hence in this regard the government had set up Gopalakrishna Committee on Governing Non-Personal Data. anonymized data. So once the data is anonymized, it becomes a non-personal data. It cannot be utilized to identify a person, and we need to regulate how these companies use them to earn profits. What Gopal Krishna Committee in its draft has said is very, very important. They have claimed that since non-personal data is collected from a group or a community, and hence it legally belongs to the community, and it has also recommended setting up a representative body from within that community which can enable data access on demand. So for example, Google utilizes our mobile locations to actually let you know the current congestion on the road or the traffic situation. Now this is a non-personal data. You cannot find out location of a person utilizing this Google map, but you know that currently almost all the roads in Delhi are red and the impact of COVID is barely visible, but nonetheless this is a non-personal data, but it has been collected through our mobile phones. And hence this is a community data, and once we demand right to it, Google should give us this data as well. Now, why it is needed? So for example, there is a person who is doing a research in public policy and they want to improve the infrastructure of Delhi, for which they will obviously need the traffic data of many years, which Google already has, and that is what they use for navigation itself. And hence for the society to come up with solutions, it is important that they be shared with the access to the community data. And for this, committee recommends setting up a representative body which shall actually authorize or ask these companies to give the public access to these data. Now, consequences, especially the positive consequences, are very easy to think of. It has already provided the legal basis for data sharing, which has been a lot of concern because these data are actually hosted in the servers located outside of India, and hence these companies more often than not deny access. Then, of course, access to such non-personal data will actually benefit the society, and also it will help domestic companies to thrive which are based on artificial intelligence or data mining and such other companies which not work for the profit of themselves but which are working for the benefit of the society. So this is the context or the background. But the article which has been published today puts forward another perspective, and which is not so encouraging as far as the draft report is concerned. The first and foremost is the fact that if you talk about the setting up of a representative body, it's nothing but an intervention on behalf of the government. And so basically, you are enabling entry of the government into an arena which was so far devoid of any government interference, and a lot of people claim that that has been the sole reason why the data has worked so effectively. Once you enable government intervention, it remains to be seen how beneficial it will be for the society. And the second important aspect is very crucial one. The committee did not talk about government data at all. So the whole report is focused on how private companies and multinationals are using data, how we can enable access to them, but you should know that government is the largest data collector. So just to give you an example, government knows who is the owner of each and every plot in our country, and this is a big data. Or for example, which plot of land is being utilized for what purpose according to the land records. And so it is important for the researchers to know or have at least access to this data if they want to devise a program in order to improve the land management in our country. And hence it is important for the society to have access to not only the data owned by MNCs but also the government data. And so why access to government data is important is because first and foremost, if government enables access, we will actually know what kind of data government actually collects from us. And so it will make government functioning more transparent. And that is what the purpose of RTI was. So government came up with right to information only to make itself more transparent as well as accountable. And hence, if public has access to almost all the data owned by the government, it will make its functioning more transparent. And the second aspect is that the taxpayers or us have actually funded the whole data collection. We have funded the whole process of collection of our data. And so we are the rightful owners, or the society at large is actual owner of that data. And hence they should be enabled access to that data. Also, public scrutiny will enhance the confidence in government data. So for example, it is not necessary that the data which government has as far as the ownership is concerned is actually correct. And if everyone can just click on a Google map and know who is an owner, we can actually improve the government data set. Having access to the government data will actually reduce the redundancy in our system. So for example, having access to large set of population data which is collected through the census will actually obviate the need for such an exercise by any other agency, because they will directly use the data which has been extensively collected by the government. And hence, this particular article puts forward the idea that the report by the committee needs to be improved, and since this is just a draft, when it comes up with a final report, it should talk about the data which is owned by the government, and it should also take care of the fact that under the garb of enabling access to the data owned by MNCs, it should not lay the grounds for government intervention. So the next article, Dissent and Detention, appears on a page number 6 as a column. Now this particular column is not that much important because it goes into the political nature of the detention which was given to Mr. Kafil Khan. Now Allahabad High Court in its 42-page order has nullified the detention of Mr. Kafil Khan or Dr. Kafil Khan, who was arrested under the provisions of National Security Act on February 13th of 2020. Now overall this column is political in nature and there is not much which can be extracted as far as UPSC examination is concerned. But what is important is to understand the detention, especially the preventive detention, and the constitutional mandate given in the part 3 or the fundamental rights of the Constitution. What actually is a detention? This is a common English word which denotes the action of detaining someone basically in official capacity. If it is done by a private person, it shall be known by the name of kidnapping. But when state does it, it is known as detention. And there are two kinds of detention: punitive detention and preventive detention. Now, punitive detention is basically to punish a person for an offense committed by him or her after a trial and conviction in a court. But preventive detention is very different from punitive detention. Preventive detention means detention of a person without trial and conviction by a court. Its purpose is not to punish a person for a past offense, but to prevent him or her from committing an offense in the near future. And hence you can say that preventive detention, if used appropriately, is only a precautionary measure and it is based on suspicion. Now, if you are aware of the fundamental rights or part 3 of our Constitution, you must know that these are governed by the provisions of Article 22 of our Constitution. And hence, since prelims is around the corner, let's just quickly go through the provisions of Article 22 itself. So if you see, Article 22 is titled as Protection Against Arrest and Detention in Certain Cases. So the first part or the first two clauses of Article 22 deal with cases of ordinary law. They confer certain rights on persons. Now here you should lay emphasis on persons and not citizens. And hence, by corollary, these rights are not only available to our citizens, but also to people who are not citizens. So according to Article 22, the people have right to be informed of the grounds of arrest, right to consult and to be defended by a legal practitioner, right to be produced before a magistrate within 24 hours, which excludes the journey time, and also right to be released after 24 hours unless the magistrate authorizes further detention. So if we just focus on the rights which have been given to all the persons under Article 22, they are enormous. And these have been made so that the state machinery cannot misuse the wide powers given to it. And hence, all the people have right to be informed of the grounds on which they are being detained. They have the right to consult a legal practitioner, and police or any other state authority cannot detain a person for more than 24 hours, which excludes the journey time, before which the detained person has to be produced in front of a magistrate. And only if the magistrate allows, the custody is extended beyond 24 hours. So these are for normal and ordinary laws. Then now the question should arise in your mind, how come preventive detention is allowed, and that too for many months? And that is because clause 3 of the Article 22 itself, which says that nothing in clause 1 and 2, which actually give these rights. It basically means that the rights given in Article 22, Clause 1 and Clause 2 will not apply to any person who, for the time being, is an enemy alien. These rights will not be available to the person who is a foreign national and belongs to an enemy country, for example, a Pakistani national. And the second clause is that these rights are not available to the person who is arrested or detained under any law providing for preventive detention. So all the people normally have access to Article 22, Clause 1 and 2. But if that person happens to be an enemy alien, or if the government is arresting that person under preventive detention law, then they cannot force the government to tell them the grounds of arrest, or they do not have immediate access to the legal practitioner, or for that matter, judicial scrutiny as well. So, what does Constitution says about preventive detention? And the conditions on preventive detention law is given by the clause 4 of Article 22, which says, no law providing for preventive detention shall authorize the detention of a person for a longer period than 3 months. So the Constitution itself says that, okay, if the government is arresting a person under a preventive detention law, all those rights which are ordinarily available to a person will not be available. But in that case also, you cannot detain a person for a period longer than 3 months. And if you are extending the period of detention more than 3 months, then you need an approval by advisory board, and the membership of the advisory board has already been described in the Constitution, which shall consist of a person who are or have been or they are qualified to be appointed as a judges of High Court. So such a committee consisting of either the judges of the High Court or the people who are fit to be appointed as a judges of High Court, if they recommend that it is important for this person to be detained for more than 3 months, only in that case the custody shall be extended. Then clause 5 itself says that as soon as possible, the grounds of detention, even in the case of preventive custody, should be communicated to the person. But if his or her grounds of detention are important to be kept secret from the perspective of public interest, then it is not bound on the authority to disclose such. You can see how Constitution of India gives fundamental rights with one hand and takes them away with another. And coming back to the same rights which were given, so now if we overall see combining the rights as well as the exceptions, you can see the rights have been given, but exceptions for enemy alien as well as in cases of preventive detention have also been given. And then again Constitution makes some rule in cases of preventive detention as well. It says the custody cannot be extended for more than 3 months, but if advisory board recommends that it is needed to be extended, it can be extended. Then Constitution says that even in cases of preventive detention, there is a need to be informed about the grounds of detention. But then again it says that if the grounds of detention needs to be secure and the release of them might lead to public disorder, then it is not important that government or the authority communicates the grounds of detention to the person who is detained. So we saw that Article 22 provided for rights, provide for exception, and then it also provides or authorizes the Parliament to prescribe the circumstances and the classes of cases in which a person can be detained for more than 3 months under a preventive detention law without obtaining the opinion of advisory board. Then it also authorizes the Parliament to prescribe the maximum period for which a person can be detained in any classes of cases under preventive detention. And it also authorizes the Parliament to prescribe the procedure to be followed by an advisory board in an inquiry. So these three are important components of Article 22 which needs to be clearly consolidated. You need to understand the rights, to be informed of the grounds, consult a legal practitioner, and to be produced in front of a magistrate within 24 hours. But if you are an enemy alien, or if you are being arrested under a preventive detention law, these rights shall not be applicable. And also Article 22 gives powers to Parliament to make laws for these three things. So since we have understood the provisions of Article 22, what is the controversy surrounding preventive detention? Now the first and foremost is that India is a democratic country and it needs to be governed on the pillars of democracy. If we compare such practices across the world, No democratic country in the world has made preventive detention as an integral part of the constitution itself as India has done it. And so it does reflects poorly on our democratic setup, given the constitution itself contains such provisions. Then, if you look at the uses of this particular provision, most of the uses in the history of our country have been political. And more often than not, they have been utilized to stifle the opposition or the critique of the government. And hence, there is a long-standing demand to put curbs on its usage. And hence, Supreme Court has stated two important things. The first is that oftentimes, even though the provisions of CRPC, IPC are available, but still the police goes for the kill and they utilize the provisions of very stringent acts like National Security Acts. And hence, the Supreme Court has said that if you have recourse to normal remedies or sufficient remedies, you can't use preventive detention. And secondly, they have said that preventive detention has to be used according to the statute. So for example, if you are detaining a person under National Security Act, now there are various grounds on which a person can be preventively detained under NSA, which basically deals with security of India, maintenance of public order. And if a person is a threat to security of India, for example, you know that a person is going to commit a terrorist act, then only you can arrest that person under the provisions of National Security Act. Otherwise, you cannot preventively detain a person, for example, a person like Dr. Kafil Khan, who was a doctor and who criticized the government actions, and you cannot detain preventively that person under the provisions of NSA. So this is it as far as preventive detention laws are concerned. Keep in mind the two kinds of detentions, the rights, the exceptions, right of the parliament to make laws and what they can prescribe, the controversies related to the uses of preventive detention, and the Supreme Court judgments and two of its important observations. The details about National Security Act and Public Safety Act shall be done in the prelims revision section. So this particular news item, Mission Karmyogi to train government officials, appears on page number 10. So just yesterday, Union Cabinet has approved launching of National Program for Civil Services Capacity Building, or NPCSCB. Now before going into the details, why it was needed, how it will change the lives of not only the civil servants but also the common people, let us first understand its relevance with respect to the overall syllabus of UPSC. Now if we just focus on this particular paragraph of GS2 syllabus, it deals with the issues of civil servants, important aspects of governance, transparency and accountability, and then role of civil services in a democracy. So this is just GS2 syllabus. Then if we move on to the syllabus of GS4, that is ethics paper, the two paragraphs of the syllabus are just dedicated to the values of civil services. And if you focus on the last line, work culture, quality of service delivery, utilization of public funds and challenges of corruption is a very important aspect of overall bureaucratic setup. And the decision which the government has taken yesterday will go a long way in changing the way our bureaucracy works. So if you focus on the life of a civil servant, they start with being an aspirant, as all of you are. They appear in examination through which they get selected. Now if you recall, just recently last week, the government has come up with wide-ranging reforms in the way we conduct entrances to a lot of services, and that was Constitution of National Recruitment Agency, or NRA. So that reform dealt with this portion of a journey of a civil servant. And the reforms which have been announced yesterday deal with this part, or the service part of the bureaucrat. Now we'll go into each and every one of them, but let's just now focus on the four key ingredients of the decisions taken yesterday by Union Cabinet. Now yesterday, the government has announced four important decisions which will encompass the overall framework which will be known by the name of National Program for Civil Services Capacity Building, under which the first announcement is the Constitution of Prime Minister's Public Human Resources Council. Then Capacity Building Commission. So this is a new and separate commission which has been constituted. We shall go into its details. Then a special purpose vehicle has been constituted which will own and operate all the digital assets and technological platforms which shall be utilized for online training of all government employees in our country. And then finally there shall be a coordination unit which shall be headed by Cabinet Secretary, which shall resolve any issues shall they arise. So let us now first start by understanding the reasons for proposing changes in the training methodology and approach for civil services. What was the need to bring about such a reform? Now these screenshots have been taken from the Prime Minister's own Twitter handle. And the Prime Minister has given 5 reasons for the changes. Now the first is lack of standardization in training priorities, competencies and pedagogy across institutes. Now if you just understand this particular line, what it says is that recruitment part will be taken care of by NRA. But post recruitment, the new joinees will go to multiple academies for training. If someone has been recruited in railway, they shall go through a training given by Railway Academy. Someone is in auditing or similarly in income tax. So what happens is the recruits, lakhs of them every year. So here we are not only talking about Group A services for which we have UPSC, but all the services. And hence, since they are trained in different academies and the curriculum which is followed is different, so there is a lack of standardization in training priorities. And it is very, very difficult to keep track of so many academies across the country as to which and what kind of training are they being imparted. For example, some of the curriculum could be so outdated that it is not even required for the services anymore. And those academies are not even including the recent advancements in their field for their course curriculum. And hence comes the question of competencies, which is basically the ability to do something successfully or efficiently. So we need to look into that as well. And finally, pedagogy or the teaching across institutes is also very, very variable. There is a lot of vacancy. And hence we need to incorporate the digital way of technology so that most of the new joinees can avail the benefits of cutting edge curricula. So this is as far as the training stage is concerned. Next comes the actual posting. And one of the long-standing problems of Indian bureaucracy has been finding officials with the right competencies for a task. So even in a single department, let's consider income tax. Not all the works which is being handled by income tax deals with the tax sheets. There are a lot of work which is required for, let's say, data mining. Then there is a lot of managerial work as well. And similarly, there is also a massive amount of transportation involved. So if you look at any kind of department, it is very, very difficult to identify the right kind of a person for a job. And we need to address that as well. And then a similar problem has been lack of linkages between role and competency. So the role a person is allocated, more often than not, it does not correlate with the competency of a person. And the best example could be the Indian administrative services themselves. For example, a person from Indian Administrative Services is often allocated to Ministry of Art and Culture, and also later on she could be transferred to Defense Ministry or Finance Ministry. Now, of course, dealing with such wide-scale assignments, it is important for the overall functioning of the government that their competencies or their own inclination and their own skills as well as their own abilities to do something should be taken care of. So for example, a person who shows natural inclination in art and culture and also has ability to manage things in that sector, for example in preserving of Indian art and heritage, should be preferentially allocated to ministries dealing with these kinds of affairs. And a person good in economics, finances and data management should be preferably allocated to Finance Ministry. Similarly for the Defense Ministry itself. And hence, this has been a long-standing problem that the role a person is allocated to and the competency she possesses often do not correlate with each other. The next problem is emergence of silos at department level due to diverse training landscapes. Now what this line means is that if you look at any particular department, there are a lot of sub-departments in one particular ministry or department. For example, if you take Home Ministry itself, there are a lot of departments within Home Ministry. For example, Department of Border Management, Department of Internal Security, and some other departments as well, which you shall see in the prelims revision. What generally happens in a government setup is that these verticals work independently of each other, and there is a very small level of interaction between them, and this is what is known as silos. Basically, it derives its name from a tall tower or pit on a farm used to store grains. So if you have seen some of the storages of grain by FCI, so these huge cylinders are called silos. So what do we mean when we say emergence of silos at department level is that just like the grains in this particular silo do not interact with grains in the next silo, similarly our government setup is such that it does not involve interdepartmental interactions, which leads to overall degradation of the governance. And in order to understand this, just focus what will happen if Department of Border Management do not regularly interact with Department of Internal Security. How closely they should be working with each other. Because ultimately if the borders are loosened, it creates internal security problems. And if internal security problems arise, they lead to issues in border management. So everything is linked, and hence there is a need for these departments to interact, which they do not. And finally, the last problem is the creation of redundancies and duplication of efforts and lack of a common platform which can actually identify such duplications and redundant activities. Now, redundant basically means unnecessary repetition, and similarly duplication. And hence the way the government of India has evolved its functioning has led to a lot of duplication. And so, for example, a lot of departments under government of India are doing similar works. It not only leads to expenses on behalf of the exchequer, which is the government itself, but it also leads to a lot of wastage as far as human resource is concerned. So now it is easy to think that since National Recruitment Agency will take care of the issues or the reforms which needs to be brought about as far as entrance is concerned. But once entrance has been taken care of, there is 25 to 30 to 35 years of service left, and you need to bring wide-ranging reforms in that part of the cycle as well. And hence, these are the major issues in the bureaucracy of our country. And for that, the government has set up Capacity Building Commission with a view to ensure a uniform approach in managing and regulating the capacity building ecosystem on collaborating and co-sharing basis. So as you can understand this, that the focus of CBC is going to be on capacity building, managing and regulating the human resource of Government of India. So what shall be the role of the commission? So the first and foremost role of the commission shall be to assist the Prime Minister Public Human Resource Council in approving the annual capacity building plans. So there shall be annual plans as to what reforms need to be brought about in the next year, just like the annual budget. And CBC will assist the top decision making body, which we have seen was constituted yesterday. So CBC will recommend the annual plans, and then as we discussed that there is a lot of divergence, or you can say the lack of coordination among the central training institutions across the country, and hence the next important task for CBC shall be to supervise central training institutions dealing with civil services capacity building. So for example, we have Labasna, NPA at Hyderabad, Nasin in Faridabad. So all these premier training institutes need to be supervised by a central commission in order to improve upon their own syllabus, curricula, the way they teach, what they teach and everything. Once we have taken care of that, next important task of this particular commission shall be to create shared learning resources including internal and external faculty and resource centers. So for example, we had the pandemic of COVID, and there needs to be a course of COVID-19 on various aspects as to what are the symptoms, how to manage, which needs to be created at the central level, and it needs to be shared with all the persons working in the civil services. Because if you see, the administration or district officials of a state, starting with the district magistrate to the Patwari level, and similarly the police of a particular state are the two main resources in fighting COVID-19. And if there is a standardized common resource which can guide each and every person about each and every aspect of COVID-19, something like a DNS, a series of videos where you can guide and share all the information which is important, and then you can mandate all the civil servants across the country to get a certificate that you have watched this course set of videos. Once you have watched that, you will get that degree. There are a lot of courses run by Government of India even now. So there is a need for creation of more such courses which will actually lessen the burden and standardize the knowledge throughout the country. Because even the Patwari can go and watch COVID-19 module, and even the DM can go and watch that module. Once they have watched those videos, an automatic certificate of completion of the module shall be generated. And similarly, the government will know that almost all the people for whom we made it mandatory, they have watched this module and now they are aware. So similarly, the CBC will coordinate and supervise the implementation of capacity building plans with the departments as well. So not only the premier training institutes, but within the departments, once they have joined the services, what will happen next? How will you ensure their constant value addition throughout the services? What each department can do to keep their officers updated, CBC will take care of that as well. Then CBC will set norms for common mid-career training programs across all civil services. So even now mid-career trainings are organized. So if a person belongs to Indian Administrative Services, they return to the same training academy after few years. Similarly for Indian Police Services and similarly for Indian Revenue Services, they return to their academies after 10 to 15 years of their service for the mid-career training. There is a need to keep track of what actually goes on in the mid-career level training. And Capacity Building Commission will actually set norms for different academies as to what shall be the course curriculum for each one of them. And finally, it will also suggest policy interventions required in the area of HR management and capacity building to the government. So now you can easily understand how wide-ranging the functions of Capacity Building Commission shall be and how serious the government is about reforming the overall setup of bureaucracy in our country. And it is just not focusing on Group A services. These recommendations are applicable to Group A, Group B, Group C, to all the services of the government. Then once we have done these two agencies, the next is Special Purpose Vehicle for owning and operating the digital assets. What is that? And that is Mission Karmayogi, a digital learning framework known by the name of iGOT Karmayogi platform. Motto is Local Problems, Global Solutions. Its objective will be to provide anytime, because of course it shall be digital, anywhere, of course again because it will be digital, so to provide anytime, anywhere learning to train about 2.5 crore civil servants. It will curate the content so that all the civil servants can make use of these resources. In order to be able to do that, you need a robust e-learning content industry. And one of the objectives of this special purpose vehicle shall be to enable this industry of content creation, especially with respect to bureaucracy or the civil services, thrive. And finally, it will create continuous, frictionless and guided capacity building for all civil servants. Now focus here on emphasis on all civil servants. So this is one of the few occasions where the Government of India does not distinguishes or discriminates among the Group A, Group B and Group C services. So these platforms shall be meant for anyone. A person belonging to any service can just log on, and whatever interests her, she can complete her training and add to her CV, and accordingly the government plans to place her within the department. So what shall be the functions and responsibilities of Karmayogi portal or this particular special purpose vehicle? The first and foremost will be, it will be very vocal for local, because of course it shall be Indian platform. This particular special purpose vehicle will be responsible for designing, implementing as well as managing this digital platform, which will be ultimately used for capacity building of our civil services. It will not only create the content, but it will have the power to buy a content. So for example, let's consider a department DT, which is Department of Electronics and Information Technology. Of course, as the name suggests, its main task is to keep up with the information infrastructure in our country. And now in the emerging trend, its employees need to be updated with artificial intelligence as well as the big data. Of course, the government academies cannot provide such an updated course modules. And hence, if the Mission Karmayogi feels that there is a course on AI and big data, which shall be very, very useful for the professionals belonging to either DATI or in any other department but dealing with information technology, it shall buy that, upload it, and the government employees can directly log on and go through this particular course, which otherwise would have been very, very expensive for them to purchase in personal capacity. Then the next task of Mission Karmayogi shall be to manage and deliver proctored independent assessments. If you have gone through the university system of education, you must have known what a proctor is, and many of you might be scared by her or his name. So proctor means invigilate an examination. So of course it will give you a course, but then it will also examine how well you have gone through that course on which they have invested money to either create or they have bought it from the market. So it will also do assessment of employees which have gone through a particular course, on the basis of which it will remotely assess your achievements, and telemetry based data scoring is a part of its work. And finally, once you have been assessed, it will give you feedback which shall be driven by artificial intelligence and which will go a long way in overall capacity building of our civil services. So now you can understand how broad the spectrum of this new reform of the government shall be. And then finally, whatever government does should yield ultimately benefits to the common citizenry, and hence what shall be the benefit for the common man. So first and foremost, now you can understand its relevance for GS4 syllabus, making civil servants responsive to citizens' needs. Because this will bring paradigm shift in the human resource management of civil services, because if ultimately we are able to appoint right person for the right job, nothing could be better for the citizens. It will make civil services more efficient, effective, accountable and responsive to the needs of the citizens, because the courses and the improvement in the way we train our civil servants and also how we do their capacity building throughout their training is ultimately going to improve the overall governance of the country, and hence it will lead to overall enhancement in the quality of governance. This is a wide-ranging set of reforms, and in mains examination, if you are writing answer in GS2 or GS4 or even in essay, if you have to give an example of how government has brought about various reforms to change the civil services, one of them would be National Recruitment Agency and the second one would be the National Program for Civil Services Capacity Building. Let's now move on to the next news. This article, Victory in a Long Battle for Equal Opportunity, appears on page number 6 in a form of column. Supreme Court in a landmark judgment in February 2020 held that all serving women officers recruited in 10 combat support arms and services of Indian Army under the Short Service Commission scheme will have to be considered for permanent commission. And hence accordingly, Ministry of Defence has issued an order for grant of permanent commission to women officers in the army. So in this regard, this particular event becomes a milestone for women empowerment, because this is one of the last bastions dominated by male members of our society, and since women have now been enabled permanent commission, we will soon see women officers at the top echelons of army. So in this regard, we have made notes for you which involves the background of women in army, the problem, the quest for equality in courts, various judgments by our judiciary, and also the Supreme Court final judgment. You can go through this discussion which has been given in our PDF, and link to the PDF can be found in the description of the video. Since the length of today's video has already exceeded, we will not be able to discuss it right here. This last news appears on page number 1. Question hour dropped in Lok Sabha schedule of monsoon session. Now recently, Lok Sabha Secretariat officially released the schedule for the monsoon parliamentary session that starts on September 14th. And in this schedule, it has come to the limelight that the question hour has been dropped. Now, opposition obviously is concerned because this is one of the mechanisms through which the opposition holds the ruling party or the government accountable. Now, please let us know in the comment sections what are the other mechanisms in the hands of the opposition parties or the parliament through which they can hold government accountable. Now, the government has said that the parliament was being held in the midst of an extraordinary situation, and hence it is not important for us to carry out question hour. So, in this regard, from the perspective of prelims examination, it becomes important for us to discuss question hour. So, basically, as the name suggests, question hour is the hour in which the parliamentarians ask questions from the ministers. So, that is like the actual work of the parliament, holding the government accountable. The first hour of every parliamentary sitting is slotted for this function. During this time, the members ask questions and the ministers usually give answers. Now, as far as the questions are concerned, there are three kinds of questions: starred, unstarred, and short notice. Now, the questions which are marked with the asterisk sign are the starred questions, which requires an oral answer, and hence, once the minister has completed her answer, another set of questions or the supplementary questions can be asked. Whereas unstarred questions are those which requires a written answer, and hence there is no scope of supplementary answers. And the third category of questions which are answered during question hour is short notice question, that is asked by giving of notice which is of less than 10 days. Now, if we talk about the start question, an MP has to give a time period of at least 15 days. Now, this time is important because ministers have to go back to their ministries, collect data, prepare their answer to be able to stand in front of all the parliamentarians as well as during the live telecast to be able to answer that question orally. Whereas if a parliamentarian wants answer to its questions and they want it to be answered within 10 days, they can never be answered orally by the minister. So this is as far as the question hour goes. Let's now move on to the prelims revision. Okay, now comes the part which all of you liked very much and was started by our phenomenal Faizan sir. And hence in this regard, we will go through some of the important aspects related to the prelims examination. And as we talked about in the video itself, National Security Act is important. We did not discuss its provisions over there. And now there are two statements. The Act extends to the whole of India and the Act empowers the central government only. Let us see if these statements are correct or not. So the National Security Act, the purpose of which was to make provisions for preventive detention in certain cases and for related matters. So this is one of the preventive detention laws, the background of which we discussed in the main discussion. The Act extends to whole of India, and hence the first statement is correct. The Act indeed extends to whole of India. The Act empowers the central government as well as the state government. So it gives powers to both parts of the federal structure to detain a person to prevent him and her from acting in any manner which can be detrimental to the security of India, relations of India with foreign countries, to the maintenance of public order, and to the maintenance of supplies and services essential to the community it is necessary so to do. So the second statement is incorrect because it said the Act empowers the central government only. Then the Act also gives powers to the government to detain a foreigner in view to regulate his presence or expel him or her from the country. And if you remember, the Constitution itself said that Parliament will make laws to provide for the maximum period of detention, and hence under the provisions of National Security Act. So if a person is arrested under such a provision, the maximum time for which the government can detain him or her is 12 months. Then let us now discuss Ministry of Home Affairs or MHA. Now a lot of times questions have been asked in prelims examination as simple as dealing with the departments. And hence in this regard it is important for us to know the departments of MHA. And so the statement says that Ministry of Home Affairs has 4 departments. Let us see how many departments are there in MHA. So if we see, there are 6 departments of Ministry of Home Affairs. Department of Border Management, Department of Internal Security, Department of Jammu Kashmir and Ladakh Affairs, Department of Home, Department of Official Languages, and Department of States. You can see how wide the functioning of Ministry of Home Affairs can be. This statement is incorrect. Let us now quickly go over to the important activities overseen by all these departments. And a lot of activities is actually given up by the name of the department itself. So for example, Department of Border Management deals with the management of borders, including the coastal borders and strengthening of the border, creating related infrastructure. Department of Internal Security deals with Indian Police Services. So one of the coveted All India services is handled by Ministry of Home Affairs, and within that it is held by Department of Internal Security. Also it takes care of the Central Police Forces, internal security and law and order situations, also terrorism and Naxalism. Also it deals with enemy aliens or inimical foreign agencies, terrorist financing, grant of visa and other immigration matters. And it also deals with matters of national integration and communal harmony, and it also deals with the matter of Ayodhya. Now this matter has been settled, but when it erupted, especially after the demolition of Babri Masjid, it created a lot of flutter to be included into one of the tasks being handled by Department of Internal Security. Then Jammu and Kashmir has been an area which has been in turmoil since last 3 decades, and hence of course there is a department committed to just overseeing the affairs of Jammu and Kashmir. Then we have Department of Home within Ministry of Home Affairs, which deals with the notification of assumption of office by President and Vice President, notification of appointment or resignation of Prime Minister, ministers, governors, nomination to Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha, census of population, registration of births and deaths. Now, here you should focus. The questions in the prelims examination can directly ask which of the following is responsible for the notification of assumption of office by the President. Now, one of the options will be given as Office of President of India. No, that notification is given by Department of Home. Similarly, we know that nominations are done to Rajya Sabha by the President, and such information is released by Department of Home. Also, the census of population is conducted by Ministry of Home Affairs under the Department of Home. We know that for a multilingual country like India, how important is language, and hence there is a committed department which is known by the name of Department of Official Languages within MHA, which deals with implementation of the provisions of the Constitution dealing with the languages as well as official languages, and also the provisions of Official Languages Act 1963. And then finally, the Department of States under the Ministry of Home Affairs deals with the matters of center-state relations, interstate relations, administration of union territories, freedom fighter pensions, human rights, prison reforms, and police reforms. So I think you can easily guess that the matters dealing with the federal structure of our country, which is already given in the syllabus, is taken care by Ministry of Home Affairs largely, and within that, Department of States take care of that. The administration of union territory, although carried out by lieutenant governors, administrators, but the directions to them are given or issued from Department of States. Then we discussed about Senapati Gopalakrishnan, who is also popularly known as Krish Gopalakrishnan. Now the statement is Gopalakrishnan was a co-founder of TCS. Now Mr. Gopalakrishnan has come out with the report we discussed on non-personal data. Now this statement is incorrect because he was a former executive vice chairman of Infosys and not TCS. Then we discussed in the same article about anonymized data, and the statement says anonymized data is the one collected from anonymous sources. Now of course if you paid attention to the lecture, you know that this is incorrect. Anonymized data is not one which is collected from anonymous sources, but rather it is a data which is stripped off or devoid of any personal information, and hence it cannot be utilized to identify a person. Let's now move on to the question of the day.